Hello, Where We Are listeners. If you're a longtime fan of this podcast or you're just joining us for the first time today, we want to tell you more about our podcast platform called Spotify for Podcasters. We've been using this platform for over a year, and it's been easy to use, and new features are added all the time. You can record and edit podcasts from your phone or computer. You don't need anything fancy, and you don't need previous podcast experience. When you hit publish, you will distribute your podcast to Spotify and everywhere else podcasts are heard. Video podcasts are also available on Spotify if that's your kind of thing. And with Spotify for Podcasters, you can earn money in a variety of ways, including ads and podcast subscriptions. But here's the thing, you can earn money, but it's a free platform. There's no catch. If you're curious or want to see what it's all about, download the Spotify for Podcasters app or go to www.spotify.com/podcasters to get started.
On today's episode of Where We Are, we talked to Collin Hansen, the author of the new biography on Timothy Keller. You're listening to Where We Are. Hello, you're listening to Where We Are. We are the Wares. I'm Michael.
I'm Melissa.
And we have a great episode. Sorry it's a bit delayed, but we knew we wanted to do this episode with Collin Hansen, and had to get the date right. And so we're happy to bring this episode to you today, and then we'll have another episode for you this weekend, so we'll be all caught up. But Melissa, I've been excited for this biography for quite some time. We've known Collin, as we talk about, we've known Collin for
several years,
for almost a decade now for me, and for you about 7 years, and just think the world of him. And I like Tim Keller too a great deal, so it's a good combination. But Melissa, do you want to tell our guests about a little bit more about Collin before we jump into the interview?
Yeah, so Collin is the Vice President for Content and Editor-in-Chief of the Gospel Coalition, as well as Executive Director of the Keller Center for Cultural Apologetics. We actually talk about the center at the end of the episode, so make sure you stick with it. He hosts the Gospel Bound podcast and has written and contributed to a lot of books, most recently, and what we will talk about, the book Timothy Keller, His Spiritual and Intellectual Formation, and he's also authored Rediscovered Church, Why the Body of Christ is Essential. He has published in the New York Times, Washington Post, and he's offered commentary at places like CNN, Fox News, NPR, and more. And he edited Our Secular Age, 10 Years of Reading and Applying Charles Taylor, and the New City Catechism devotional, amongst other books. He is a member of Iron City Church in Birmingham, Alabama, and he is an adjunct professor at Beeson Divinity School, where he also co-chairs the advisory board. So that's quite the resume.
Quite the resume.
And this conversation was so good, and he helps us to deep dive a bit on this biography about Pastor Keller, and gives us a couple of surprises. I mean, bunch of things that I didn't know.
He delivered with the juice. Yes.
So we think that y'all will really enjoy it. We know that we have plenty of listeners who are big fans of Tim Keller. So,
and regardless, I mean, one thing that really comes across is whether you're a quote unquote fan of Keller, whether you're Presbyterian, whether you're evangelical, whatever, Tim Keller is someone who had a significant influence and continues to have a significant influence on late 20th century, 21st century American life. So just as a historical matter, I think this biography is going to be a significant contribution, and then just as a Christian, I'm really interested to read more deeply about some of the influences that shaped him. So here's the interview with Collin Hansen on the new biography, Timothy Keller, His Spiritual and Intellectual Formation. Collin Hansen, so glad to have you on Where We Are. Thanks for being with us.
Oh, I am excited about this. Thanks, guys.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
We were just before we hit record. We were talking. We've known each other for quite some time, including
True.
7 years ago. We were in Israel together, which is just fun to think about.
It was
A
amazing.
lifetime ago.
Yeah, I saw a photo. I won't name her here, but we had someone else who was on that trip had her baby, her son, with
Yes.
them, and it was just jarring to see the photo of this baby and be like, "That was 7 years ago." But a lot has happened
That's true.
over the last 7 years. One thing that's developed that we're really excited to talk with you about today is you have authored a biography of Tim Keller.
True.
And I think where I'd love to start is how did this come about?
Mhm.
How did you
Yeah.
decide to write this book, and what was the process of even sort of deciding to do it? What did that look like?
Well, the idea went back to May of 2020, and many of us will remember that time. It was
Yes.
when it was sort of like, a couple weeks, 6 weeks. We remember that for the lockdowns from COVID. Well, May of 2020 is also when Tim got his diagnosis of pancreatic cancer.
Yeah.
Right.
And so in the course of that, I had been essentially begging people for years to write a biography of Tim Keller.
Yeah.
And then it just sort of struck me, wait a minute, we could lose him. And then I thought, well, somebody has got to write this. And thankfully, the publisher, Zondervan, Reflective, they reached out to Tim and they made a recommendation of, we'd like to do this book. Here's what we think it should be like. It's not quite a traditional biography because you're still around and we don't have the full story yet.
Yeah.
And then third, we would like you to consider Collin to writing it. And thankfully Tim had agreed, and then they invited me then to do that, because my thought was, I just want somebody to do the book.
Yeah.
And I don't care if it's me or anybody else, but if I were doing it, this is what I would do. Knowing Tim, he does not like to talk about himself. He likes to talk about other people and what he's reading.
Yes, this is true.
Yeah, so you guys know. So that was essentially how it happened. And I think if you're close with somebody personally and professionally, like we are, you got to be upfront and got to be clear about that from the beginning. And one of the major issues there is that you have to know what the person is willing to let you write about. Now, that was a little bit easier in this case because I wasn't writing about everything. I'm writing about the influences. Sure. So I'm not trying to tell the full story of everything that happened in the church and every controversy and everything with their family. I wasn't trying to do that. But still, I think it was interesting to go through the process just to kind of think, the people that I talked to, they've never talked before with anybody about Tim, from Tim's sister to the best friend in their wedding to the friends who came to Christ early on in their ministry. So that's kind of, I give it a long answer, but that's how it kind of came about, and that's the particular character of the book.
Yeah, no, that's great. A lot of the questions I want to ask you, I guess this is sort of the top line, but how early on in his studies, in his career, in his ministry, it kind of, as you talked to somebody who knew him, what was it clear that Tim Keller was Tim Keller at Gordon Conwell? Was it clear that Tim Keller was Tim Keller when he was knocking on doors in New York City? What was your?
I love that question.
On that? Yeah.
I love that question. It's very perceptive, and the answer I'll give it has to be multifaceted. Yes, I think if you met Tim Keller in college or in seminary, I think you would recognize, except for the whole hair thing. I think you would. I think you would recognize the same person. I think you'd recognize the intelligence, the thoughtfulness, the insight. And I'll tell you the story at Gordon Conwell. Got this from Tim and Kathy's really close friend, Louise Midwood. She was there with her late husband and then also with Tim and Kathy. And she said after class, we would go back and we'd go to Tim's dorm room and he would redo the lecture just a little bit different with his own spin and his own insight. And so you could see from that very beginning, he was exactly what we would expect of Tim Keller. He's teaching you about C.S. Lewis. He's teaching you about Jonathan Edwards. He's teaching you about whatever, but it's always his, you don't realize how much of himself and his own insight that he's putting in there. So in that level, yes. Yeah. At another level, absolutely not. And I love this little story from Bruce Henderson, best man at their wedding. Wedding was performed by R.C. Sproul. I love this. Exactly. So I love this story. So I'm talking to Bruce and I'm saying, what did you think about Tim and Kathy after Gordon Conwell going to Hopewell, Virginia? Just total culture shift for them. A couple of Pennsylvanians. And I said, what did you think about that? And he said, well, they must have been desperate. And I said, I mean, yeah, they must have been. I mean, they were studying, Tim and Kathy were studying for the civil service exam, for the postal service. I mean, yeah, they must have been desperate. And he said, no, Collin, I mean, the church must have been desperate for them. And he says they would not have been impressive. And that was a major theme of their lives. Tim is a trumpet player and a drum major in the marching band, and Kathy's the school newspaper editor, and they're just kind of nerdy. I mean, they're just not the students who stand out. They're not the alpha leaders that the professors and people like R.C. Sproul were drawn to. So in that level, no, you really wouldn't have recognized them because you could not have seen them having that kind of just sort of success in the future.
Yeah. Melissa, I'm going to ask one more question.
Okay, go ahead.
I can see you're championing the bit right there.
Yeah. I just want to step back. This is an impossible question to answer, but I'm interested in how you'll answer it, which is who is Tim Keller? So many of our listeners will be familiar with Tim, although some may be familiar with him through sort of one, maybe his books, but not be familiar with his with Redeemer, or maybe familiar with his public lectures, but not other aspects of his ministry and sort of public presence. Not to mention who he is as a man, and so kind of. Who is Tim Keller? Why is he of public interest?
Yeah. Well, it's a good question to ask a journalist, because we have to do morbid things like imagine obituaries, right?
Yeah.
And you have to write them ahead of time, and so in an obituary, you basically have a sentence to explain why they should care about somebody. And I think in a sentence, Tim Keller is one of the most significant Christian leaders in the world of the late 20th and early 21st century centuries, and primarily due to his work in engaging evangelicals in city centers around the world.
Yeah.
That's the short way to put it. And as Tim will be very clear to point out, it's not that there wasn't evangelical activity in urban areas in the 1970s and 1980s. Of course there were, especially among non-white populations. And in New York, talking about the boroughs. But when you consider that in the early 1900s, New York City was still considered the evangelical capital of America, And you think about places like the American Bible Society. You go back, the largest revival in American history, 1857-58, started in New York City. Think about all the different evangelistic events. Billy Graham came 100 years after that event in New York City to mark that occasion. It was his most famous evangelistic event of all time. That was not the case in the 1970s because of the political and racial upheaval in 1980s. And so going to New York at that now, or DC or Boston or any number of other cities, and certainly global cities, it was a totally different story. We're saying that literally in Manhattan, as I consistently talked to people who were Christians, they would say two things to me. That they said, number one, we felt like we're the only Christians in all of Manhattan. Now, especially Protestant evangelical. Clearly, you've got some Catholic population and whatnot there. But the second thing was that they said there were literally 4 churches that we would go to in all of Manhattan. And on top of that, they did not really feel much like New York. They felt like they could have been located somewhere else, but they didn't feel authentically New York. So I basically, I say in a nutshell that at age 35, before he went to Westminster Seminary, Tim Keller had no experience with mercy ministry, urban ministry, or global ministry. And those 3 things are basically what came to, they're the things that made him him. That's his academic work, mercy ministry, his city ministry in New York and specifically, and then global, his global church planting, city center outreach through Redeemer City to City. So another way to put it, Michael, is that he's essentially the closest we have in his generation to John Stott in his previous generation. I think they have a tremendous number of similarities between the two of them.
Yeah. Melissa.
Well, to partly off of what you just said, how did Tim transition from somebody who those things were in his wheelhouse to becoming this person where he's known for these various things?
Well, it's pretty typical for Tim that Kathy was first in almost everything. So she had experience, I think, in seminary in working in inner city Philadelphia, if I remember correctly. The global part, Kathy was one of the last people that C.S. Lewis ever wrote to. So Kathy then, even as a young teenager, I think 15, went to the Kilns, actually met with Lewis's brother because he had died in 1963. And went and visited the house, hung out. Later made a joke to Douglas Gresham that if his mother hadn't married C.S. Lewis, that she would have given her a run for her money. I mean, just crazy stuff in there. So she had that global perspective. She had the city perspective. And then the Mercy Ministry developed largely through his Demon Doctor of Ministry study and studying Reformed ministries and in Protestant post-Reformation period. Anyway, but yeah, that's a lot of it's through Kathy. I mean, if you take a step back, Kathy was the first one to embrace Reformed theology. Kathy's the one who introduces him to the Chronicles of Narnia series. But Kathy's typically at that age and stage. She's the one who's kind of bringing him along and just introducing him to different stuff. So, but yeah, I mean, the other basic answer to that question is that Tim is, and you would know this if you knew him as a 3-year-old. He started reading at 3. And we're not talking, he had an extremely over-the-top driven mother, Italian Catholic mother. But there wasn't anything particularly special necessarily about their household, but Tim was reading on his own by 3 and he is just a lifelong learner. You guys know this. Even now, who knows how much time he's had? How's he spend his time? Reading books. I mean, he keeps learning. He's a lifelong learner. So how do you get that way? He keeps growing. That's how it happens. He never stopped developing.
So there's been, and we don't need to get too deep into this, but there was a bit of sort of online debate suggesting that Tim Tim, had it easy in New York and wouldn't possibly understand the negative culture that evangelicals and Kansas.
You went there. Don't get me started on
Yeah,
this.
yeah. But so I raise that not to sort of, but it is, and so I was 2009, 2010. There was the big debate around in New York about whether churches should have access to public schools, and for on the weekend for services, and there had to be a sort of cross-denominational sort of pushback, but sort of the antagonism in New York, or maybe just however you want to phrase it, sort of how did he build an evangelical ministry in New York City that not only sort of was successful in a self-contained way, but is something that reached out beyond sort of traditional evangelical circles, and not only reached the city, but reached not just the world, but just aside, it would be amazing to me when I was at the White House, the number of people who would ask about Tim, the journalists, elected officials who you would not have identified as being particularly reading Christian sort of thought leadership books all the time, but they knew Tim. How was he able to do that? I've heard these stories of when he was at the forefront of his ministry in New York, that he sort of did these door to door. I mean, he just collected and amassed incredible information about, the market, if you want to use those terms. But how did he build an evangelical ministry in New York?
Yeah, well, that could be a really long, fun discussion.
Yeah, sure.
Let me see how to summarize that. A few different things, but one of them is that I don't think he would have, if you had wound back the clock 10 years, I don't think it would have worked. So New York changed a lot in the 1980s, which is why I situate the book against the backdrop of the famous movie Wall Street, against Tom Wolfe, Bonfire of the Vanities, against Wolf of Wall Street. All of that is written right before Tim goes. So, so the political, and Tim and Kathy go there with their boys, the political situation in New York dramatically changes, and it's the rise of the yuppies. This is Reagan administration, Bush administration, Bush first administration years. And then, of course, into the 90s, you have this epic rise of New York. You've got the combination of Giuliani, but of course, most of us, if we weren't paying attention to the politics necessarily, were watching Letterman, Friends, Seinfeld, all that sort of stuff. So at one level, it worked because New York was changing. And way more people moving in, especially, as my friend who pastors in New York often will put it, he'll say, yeah, I live in New York City, as in I live in the rom-com Upper West Side.
Yeah, right.
Meg Ryan's Upper West Side. So you've got mail. And so that you really can see that changed a lot. And the second thing I'd add on top of that is that Tim he doesn't agree with everything that Leslie Newbigin says, but the basic premise that the West needs a missionary encounter, and essentially bringing a lot of the missiology of the rest of the world, contextualization, indigenization, all those languages, that wasn't commonplace in the United States. So the idea in the 1970s and in the 1980s, so the idea that we would have a church in New York where, number one, everyone would be taught to love the city.
Yeah.
That was a novel concept to evangelicals in New York at the time. Like, oh, we'd love the city. We wouldn't just talk about how much we hate living here and how we have. No, so they'd have all night prayer meetings during the first Gulf War. They believed that, and I'm not joking. They're like, the reason crime went down in the 1990s is because we prayed about it. Well, who am I to tell them that they're wrong about that? So they loved the city. They were there. It was a church that felt like New York. It quoted the poets, and
Yeah,
prophets of New York, but was always rooted in scripture as well. And then a third thing I'd say is that Tim made a missiological decision in New York to say that we're not going to emphasize all the ways that we're different from other Christians. We're going to emphasize the ways that we're different from non-Christians. And I think that created a kind of ecumenical flavor that made a big difference in the city and allowed a lot of people to be interested in what Tim had to say and what the church was preaching, who might have had a little bit of resistance otherwise.
Yeah, no, that's super powerful, Collin. Can you talk about? I mean, we talked a little bit about Tim as pastor. Can you reflect a bit on Tim as sort of international thought leader, reason for God, some of the sort of big stages that he had? I think it is fair to say one of the biggest sort of intellectual, theological gifts he's given to the church is this sort of city missions work. What do you think has been his signature sort of contribution to the public?
Well, what's fascinating is that 9/11 put a pretty big spotlight on Redeemer, as you'd imagine.
Right.
The church was already large, but it got even larger, and there was so much attention about the attacks and about Christians who were there. And then in that kind of aftermath period, you did see a good bit of attention. I mean, a lot of people don't realize that Tim preached the downtown 5-year memorial service with President Bush. So, I mean, it's clearly he was well known then, but even then, you're still several years before he publishes his first 2 best-selling books, and only then does the things really take off. And I tried to situate that ministry against the backdrop of a lot of the pushback against the disintegration of the second Bush administration, second term. And so by that point, the kind of the values voters 2004 election, which is still the last time the Republicans have won a popular vote. There was a lot of he was kind of a central figure of trying to push back against the rise of the new atheists. And things like that. So that's the context there. But I'm going to say something controversial just for you guys on this podcast, because I think it fits you guys pretty well here. I think Tim Keller was perfectly suited as a leader, as an evangelical leader for the first administration Obama era. If you're like me and you subscribe to the kind of perspective of the 4 Americas that you've seen through the Atlantic and some of those publications, Tim perfectly fits the first Obama administration, quote unquote, smart America approach. More or less like, we're going to dialogue, we're going to reason. There's an upward mobility. There's a sort of learning class, kind of like Richard Florida's. Like smart America. Everybody's moving to cities. It's all about the information workers, that kind of thing. And so I think that's like the Lord seemed to really suit his giftings and his experience and his insights for that kind of time. And I'm not saying it wouldn't have applied at any other time, but I would say that moment changed, as you guys know better than I do, after 2012 or during 2012, and then it really changed after 2016, and it feels like a few lifetimes ago by that point. And it doesn't mean he doesn't still have insight, but now you just have such a fractional dynamic that it's hard for him to get a hearing on that sort of left of center smart America. But at the same time, the quote unquote real America of Palin and Trump and whatnot. I mean, those are the folks that are interviewing me who are furious that he's a registered Democrat. It just doesn't seem possible to them that would be the case. And I try to say something like, well, Billy Graham was a registered Democrat too, but it doesn't seem to, kind of land with people. But so again, I'm saying that just for you guys, because you will uniquely relate to that and understand that. But I think that's part of your answer. I mean, the answer, Michael, is that was a particular time and place, and that was when he became that global type leader.
Right.
Yeah.
I can see that argument for sure. And we're talking about the Four Americas, and it's an Atlantic article.
Well, and then it was a book by George Packer.
By George Packer. So for anybody who wants to go look it up, it's George Packer.
Yeah, I knew you guys would know, but thank you for giving the context in there. So let me to round that out. It sort of shows that now there's this battle between smart America and just America. It's kind of like the millennials versus Gen Z. And so the left is fragmented. And then there's real America versus, I can't remember what the other one is. It's kind of like National Review America, like traditional conservative, like Reaganite conservative.
Yeah.
And they don't get along. There's like a populist / middle class dynamic there. So it's just sort of, you've seen that fracturing from a basic, just a splintering on both sides. And so now it's kind of like it's hard for anybody to find their foot. I mean, bottom line, there is just doing this because it's you guys. There's a reason we still have not elected a president except who was famous before the internet.
Right.
And for smartphones. There's a reason we haven't done that, because everybody else is coming up in a fragmented world, can't get traction across the various factions. This is why we have presidents in their late 70s into their 80s, because we don't have any unifying figures anymore. Yeah. So that's kind of what I'm getting at with Tim as well. He's got a lot of broad-based appeal, but he's not like a hardcore fractional figure. And a lot of the people who have emerged since then are really deliberately divisive figures.
Yeah. No, I mean, Collin, I saw it. I think it's exactly right. I think I have a few other questions for you. I do want to ask you. So we've sort of talked about Tim Keller, the pastor, Tim Keller, the thought leader. I want to ask you about just Tim Keller, the man. Mm-hmm. But before I do that, Tim is a friend, has become a friend, and is in every experience I've had with him is just the real deal. My introduction to him was to your point. He was asked to deliver a prayer at the White House for the president's Easter prayer breakfast. And it was my job to help organize portions of that breakfast. And I was 22 years old.
Amazing.
And I'd read a great deal of what Tim had written. Anytime I was in New York, I worshiped at Redeemer, but I didn't know him. And all of a sudden I was emailing him, and I was asked to find out what scripture he was going to. I'm sorry, it wasn't a prayer; it was a scripture reading for the Easter prayer breakfast. And I'll never forget. I was just terrified to send Tim Keller. Who am I to send Tim Keller some potential scriptures he might want to use? I send this email just terrified, and I get an email back from Tim half hour later saying, I think the first passage you chose from Corinthians is perfect. I'll use that. And there was something about the humility of that, something about the fact that I think he probably sniffed a bit of like eager to please and like sort of nervousness on me. And it was just such like a personal gift that is not always common. People don't always react to that sort of thing in such a humble way. So that's how I met Tim. That was 13, 14 years ago. Mm-hmm. Would love to have a few other questions to ask you, sort of related to Tim, but not the book so much. But the last sort of book question I have for you is, what kind of man is Tim from all the conversations you've had and what you've written in this book?
I love Catherine Alsdorf was a big help. You guys know Catherine, and she was a big help to the book. And I interviewed a bunch of the early Redeemer Presbyterian Church members, and I had just loved this experience. She'd be crying, talking about how much Tim had meant to her and how much he'd shown her about God, and then she'd see me writing that down, and then she'd look at me and she'd be like, "Now don't make him out to be a saint.
Yeah,
He
yeah,
messed up all these different things, and we were upset at him, and he really had to listen to us, and
yeah.
and then and then Tim would come back and he'd say, "Yeah, I'm a pretty bad leader," and I was like, "Tim, you're definitely not a bad leader, but I can attest you're a pretty bad manager." And when you're working closely with somebody on a book like this, it's not always clear what you should say, what you should not say.
Yeah.
And if you want to know, there are a lot of ways that Tim could have encouraged, pressured me to write the story a different way other than what it was. And he didn't do that. Kathy didn't do that. That tells you what you need to know. That helped a lot. I learned from his assistant, Craig Ellis, early on in the interviews.
Yeah.
He said, the people close to Tim, they love him. They don't idolize him.
Yeah.
And I think we often have a kind of reverse attitude that so many leaders will insulate them with people who can't disagree with them about anything, can't challenge them. And you have this cult of hero worship that develops, and that's just not the case around Tim. I mean, there's lots of us who from a distance just think the world of him and so appreciative of him. And the people who know him do too, but in the sense of, but they know him as the full person. It's just he's not trying to pose. And I think that's one other thing.
There's no halo. Yeah.
No, it's just,
and there's just a shining light, a spotlight on him when he walks in the room.
No, and you don't, he doesn't suddenly change. And so I can always know. I mean, I probably shouldn't share this little anecdote, but every single time Tim calls me, he always insults me in some way. I think it's his love language is insult. And he's like looking at a picture of my son holding the book, and he's like, "Collin, that picture of your son holding the book, he looks just like you. Why would you do that to someone?"
No, Tim.
Yeah.
I was like that. Yeah. I was like, he doesn't mean it, he's just joking with you, but like, that's just, he's just always the same in that sense. And, I have never heard him criticize another human being. That is amazing.
Yeah.
I mean, when you consider all that happened, I mean, he doesn't like to be criticized. He definitely gets frustrated with that. But even then, he's sort of like, "Oh, let me just explain what's happening here." And you're like, okay. So that's just what he's like. I'm just grateful for him and hope he's around for a lot longer because I'll miss him when he's gone. Yeah.
My last question is, was there, at any time, were you surprised by anything, anyone, any story while writing this? Because I know that you know Tim, but did anything surprise you?
Well, I think people are going to learn a lot in this book. I think they're going to be pretty surprised by some stuff, not negatively necessarily, but just I think they'll realize how little Tim talks about himself, because all of a sudden they'll say, "Oh, I didn't realize I didn't know anything about that." So the one thing that stands out by far, and I think is, I don't know, maybe the most important contribution of the book, we'll see, but Tim has not talked much about his younger brother. And so I talked extensively with his younger sister. She's in the middle of them, and she gave me amazing insight on Tim, on the family, and she adores her older brother. So that was really fun. But Billy died in 1998, and he died of AIDS and for most of his adult life was practicing practicing homosexual. So that story is not one that a lot of people know. It was a very sensitive issue for Tim because he feared that talking about his brother would have the opposite effect of what it was intended. It would make people feel like he was exploiting his brother. And but I think that when people go into that hospice, in the book, when they go into that hospice room with his brother who was supposed to die quickly but lived for months longer than people expected, when they think about his parents at his bed singing to him day after day after day before he died, they think about the pastors who came to visit him as well, and were there with him when his friends had abandoned him. And then most importantly, I think for the book, and I'll leave a little bit of mystery here, when they think about Tim having preached his younger brother's funeral. And I like to just kind of tease it this way and say, what do you think Tim Keller would have preached at his younger brother's funeral? What message, what passage would he preach? And I think once people see that chapter, the light bulb is going to go off and they'll say, of course, I should have known that's exactly what he preached. But that was the biggest surprise. And I got to give a big old shout out to our friend Craig Ellis for that, because I said, Tim, you must have preached your younger brother's funeral. Yeah, I did. There must be a recording somewhere. Sure. Where is that recording? I have no idea.
But Craig does. Yeah.
2 days later, a day later, Craig says, I got the notes right here. Well, amazing. I don't think everybody's ever seen those before. That I'm aware of. So that was a big deal. I'll just give people a hint. It's just about the most famous stuff that Tim has ever said. It's close to his own autobiography in the sense of just the transforming power of grace. But it's 10 years before it would be published for a broader public.
Yeah. Hey, we just want to give you an opportunity. You're not just an author. Gospel Coalition, just a week or two ago, you announced the Keller Center for Cultural Apologetics. Talk a bit about sort of where TGC is, about the mission of the Keller Center and how that fits into sort of the scene here. And we'd just love to hear more about the work you're up to.
Well, I think the most encouraging thing since that report, Michael, has been how many people like yourself have reached out and been like, we need to work together on this. Like, it just seems like a lot of us are sensing the need to do similar things in a very, very rapidly changing religious environment. We've got to find a way to help get Christians working together on evangelism and discipleship for a post-Christian context, which is not something the church has any experience with in its history. We have pre-Christian, we have Christendom, but we don't have post-Christian. Now, other parts of the West are more post-Christian than the United States, at least in aggregate. Certain parts of the United States, obviously much of the East Coast, especially the Northeast and the Northwest, I mean, they definitely are a lot like Europe, Northern Europe especially. But so the idea is simply we've got to get people working together in politics, in the marketplace, in the academy, in the church to address this fact that 40 million Americans have left the church in the last 25 years. And everything that we are seeing, the massive transformations that we're seeing in the electorate, both parties in different ways, but both parties. And I mean, all of this is affected by that transformation in religion. So we've got to get people working on that together. And we've got to develop faithful apologetic messages that both appeal to non-Christians in a thoroughly secular context and at the same time help disciple our own young people in our churches to be able to flourish as Christians in those environments. So that's the basic idea. We don't know how much longer Tim's going to be with us. We would love it if the Lord raised up another Tim Keller for the next generation, but it'd be better if we all learned together how to, not to repeat what Tim did, but to think the ways that he has been thinking and learn to apply it for our own generation. So that's the basic idea. And as one of the legacy ministries that Tim Keller founded, this is what we've wanted to do to honor him and honor that contribution, and to further solidify our intent to maintain a posture of focus on, or maintain a focus on evangelism and discipleship, but especially in the context of a increasingly post-Christian era. I mean, just think about this, guys. Our foundation documents, our theological vision for ministry at the Gospel Coalition, was written and drafted originally by Tim Keller and written in 2007.
Yeah.
In many ways, that thing is still perfectly true, but we keep coming back to this. How much has changed since 2007?
Yeah.
Quite a bit.
Yeah,
so
sure.
we got to keep rethinking these things, not because we're going to have a different gospel, but because, just like we've been talking about in this discussion, contextualized in new and necessary ways for the 21st century.
Yeah. Well, hey, I'm so excited about this book. It is published. It's out in the world. People can buy it at their favorite bookstore. And I'm excited about the work you're doing at TGC and at the Keller Center. And I just hope that this book blesses folks as they get to learn more about the influences that shaped Tim. And it's a legacy worth many people sort of carrying what they can of it for all the fruit that it's borne over the years. So, Collin, thank you so much for being with us. Really glad to have you.
Oh, I just love doing this with friends. That was a lot of fun. Thanks, guys.
Yeah, thanks. Well, I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Collin Hansen. I'm excited for so many people to read the biography, and I'm also just excited about Collin and the work he's doing at the Gospel Coalition. He's a great guy. But that's the episode. Again, we'll be back this weekend. Melissa, we do just before we head out, we do want to tell folks about an opportunity and really just a way that they could help us. Can you brief them?
Yes. Thanks for listening, and we always love hearing from you. So we have a survey link in the show notes, and we would love it if you filled out the survey. It will tell us how we're doing, and it will let us know how you're doing, which we would love to know and to get to know you better. So please fill it out, and one respondent will win a copy of Michael's book, Reclaiming Hope, and the book Compassion and Conviction, which Michael co-authored with Justin Gibbity and Chris Butler. So go and fill it out in the show notes. Greatly appreciate it.
All right, friends, that's all we have for you. We'll be back this weekend, but this has been Where We Are.
Bye.